So we are back with our next set of guests. So I guess we'll start off with some intros. So we have the Mega Cat Studios team, but I guess we can just go down the line because we have a new guest here. So I'm Matt. I've introduced myself a few times, but I'm a developer advocate at Twitch, and I have my coworker Travis here. Do you want to give a brief intro?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Travis Brown. I lead the solutions architecture team at Twitch, which is on the developer relations side, so I get to work with a lot of game devs doing awesome stuff. And I am also a huge retro fanatic.
That's what I like to hear.
I just wanted to come on to this one session to have a chance to talk to you guys.
That's great.
Yeah. So it's great to have Travis. You might have probably seen him on other streams as well, but it's great to have you as a host. And
Thank
then
you.
would you want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. I'm Andrew Marshal. I'm the lead designer at Mega Cat Studios. I'm the guy who spends way too much time messing around with NESs and Sega Genesis and figuring out how it all works and how to design games for it.
I'm Marshal Carper. I help with a lot of our marketing, client communication, marketing activations, that kind of thing. And I'm here to support Andy's genius because Andy does a lot of really cool stuff with retro hardware.
Awesome.
I try to.
So I believe that our guests actually have prepared some slides for us. Is the computer all
Yep,
ready?
we're all good to go.
Okay, can we switch? Okay, we got the signal, so everyone should see that. So yeah, why don't you walk us through what you have there?
All right, awesome. First slide we have here is just running through some of the basic tools that we use. For visuals, we can work with any tool we want, but we have to work within the restrictions of the consoles that we're working with. Sound, we have to use specialized tools to get chiptunes made that fit with the actual sound chips on the systems. With gameplay, we're using our own tool chains and things to import levels and import game design. And then one thing that a lot of people like to bring up now is the NES Maker, which is a program that someone came out with to easily make NES games. For us, it's great for prototyping, and as it continues to develop, we're really excited about using it to make small-scale games that are a little bit more accessible and easy for people.
Yeah, and I think it's important to jump in real quick. We're talking about actual retro development. So this is not retro-inspired development. This is development that will play on classic hardware. So NES, SNES, Genesis, cartridges and everything. So this is very hardware restrictive development that we're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Wait, so you're basically saying you're developing new games, but just on these
old
systems.
hardware.
Yep. Yeah.
Old hardware. That's
Yeah.
really,
Brand new
really cool.
experiences
Got it.
for like the Super Nintendo.
So are you walking us through maybe like a recent example, or?
Yeah, I'm going to give you some examples of some of the technical hurdles that we deal with
Awesome.
when we're doing that.
Okay.
Cool.
So these are just this is a basic overview of some of the restrictions we deal with. Graphics are stored tile-based. We have to deal with restrictions on the palette, the amount of sprites we can have on screen, rendering limits for what's showing up. There's limitations on how the backgrounds work. Attribute tables are a piece of that. That's how palettes are loaded. I'll get into that a little bit more in depth in a minute.
And a tile-based graphic storage?
Yeah, so that means the way the graphics are stored on the consoles is the graphics are actually stored in 8x8 pixel tiles. And you can have a certain amount of those loaded into RAM at once.
Yeah, and there's also lots of really cool tricks on how you can optimize that. Like you play the original Super Mario Brothers, the clouds and the bushes are the same like graphic.
Yeah, and they just load a different palette over them.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, and the wild thing is, 30-some years later, we're still finding new tricks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Interesting.
That's awesome.
That's really cool. Okay.
So this is a little bit more high level of it. If you actually see on the first image there, that is one of our games, the meeting that we're working on. That is all of the sprites that are being loaded into the graphics processor on the NES at once. That is the most that we can do at one time. And with this, we're dealing with scanline limitations, character sizes,
Wow.
limitations on the CPU and the PPU, which is the graphics processor. And there's a lot of limitations we have to deal with.
And for people on stream, so a sprite is exactly, it's like a character?
Yeah, it's the character.
Okay.
So like your player character, the enemies. So if you're talking about Super Mario Brothers, like Mario or a Goomba, those are sprites.
It's something that will essentially be animated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you guys ever implement or use like FPGAs during your development process? Like.
We do. Our process is a little weird. So as we start developing like on emulation, and then as we get further along, we actually, as I showed you before this presentation, we do like hand soldered boards and stuff. So we actually set up like socket boards to like test them on the hardware and do it that way.
Wow. That's, yeah, no, this is so new to me. I know you have
I love
sort of a retro game.
Yeah, I've
like,
really I love the community. I've done some ROM hacks in my day.
Okay. Oh,
nice,
and
nice,
even
nice, yeah.
actually like I've done like roster hacks where I actually like burned a chip and so I could play like sports stock baseball with the latest roster.
Oh yeah,
and things
definitely. Like
that.
Tecmo,
That's
there's a lot of
awesome.
that. Yeah. So this is like one of our biggest hurdles that we have to deal with is the horizontal scanline limitation. So when we're talking about sprites, on the NES especially, you can only have 8 sprite tiles per scan line. So 8 of those 8x8 pixel tiles you can only have on a scan line. What a scan line is on an old CRT television, it renders the image one line at a time. So in the image I'm showing here, you can see the white lines running through it. That's representative of the scan lines on a television. It's basically one pixel across the screen. And so you can only have
Wow.
8 of those tiles on a scan line at a time before it stops rendering them.
So this kind of brings a whole new appreciation when you play old games too, because they were working under these restrictions to begin with. But it's also a big consideration when you pick up a retro game. You can understand why they made a lot of these design choices. Because today we showcase one of this, and they're like, "Yeah, wouldn't it be great if like you punch the ground, an explosion happened?" Like, "Yeah, it would be cool."
It would be fantastic if I could do it.
Hardware can't do it, so you
Yeah.
have to work within these limits, which is really half the fun and half the creativity a lot of times.
Yeah, definitely.
I think one thing I've always loved about this era of gaming is that those limitations sometimes were like the inspiration to make these very unique titles.
Oh, absolutely. Like even today with us, those limitations sort of drive our design a lot of times.
Yeah, very cool.
So this is where something called sprite flickering comes into play. This is something, if you are familiar with, especially the NES, you'll see a lot. The sprites will like flicker in and out every other frame. And I'm using this picture from Mega Man to sort of show it off. The reason why they do that is they're displaying the sprites every other frame against each other, so they can display more than 8 tiles, like seemingly more than 8 tiles at once. But really, they're turning them on and off every
They're
frame.
just alternating.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so that
Wow.
becomes a big tool that you have to think about using, especially when you're doing like larger sprites and things like that.
So that's why, like the old arcade games, a lot of the characters will flicker.
Yeah.
Is that what's happening?
Yeah, it's so they can cheat rendering limits.
Yeah, I've played those different.
Yeah.
I forget.
Mario
but
3 is another big.
Like they'll just flicker. Okay.
So when we get into stuff like palette restrictions, it gets pretty interesting, especially on the NES. When you're creating a background for the NES, it loads its palettes in 16 pixel blocks at a time. So in this image, I have a grid overlaid, so you can actually see where the palettes change on the screen. Where we had to like be selective about, okay, now it's going to switch over to blue like 16 pixels later, because it's just a very hard grid that you have to work within. And these are the attribute tables that I was talking about, is what decides what palette's going to be loaded and what 16 pixel block.
And that means there has to be a lot of deep communication with the artists, because the artists have to be planning ahead on these kinds of things to develop the assets that we need.
Totally.
Yeah, especially like when they're choosing their palettes and things. Like they want to think about like, okay, well maybe I want to share the same color between these 2 palettes to blend that grid a little bit more.
And so, what specific tools like do you use
From the art and design side of things, we actually use modern tools. Some people use Photoshop. I go open source. I use GIMP. I actually find GIMP to be pretty good for palette manipulations and doing like pixel art style work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these days there's a lot of great resources on this kind of stuff. So we have a lot of Unity blogs around how do you set up a modern workflow for this kind of stuff, so you can be in those restrictions. I didn't mean to cut you off. You're about to say something.
I mean, just like those modern tools, do they have like plugins to cut up tiles and like?
It was funny. I was using a separate program for that. For the longest time, we had a blog post about it, and a guy who wrote a plugin for GIMP emailed us. He's like, "Hey, I just wrote this plugin that does all of that.
That's so
like,
cool.
here, take it."
Yeah.
And it works fantastic.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what's cool about this community in general. So we look at this as like a professional level. We do this full time, but there's a really cool hobby scene behind it too, where people are doing, like you talked about, homebrew stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a really passionate base of people here that are creating and sharing tools and knowledge all the time.
Yeah, and I mean that's how I got into it, is doing like hobbyist style stuff, like doing some ROM hacks and like learning my way around the consoles. So we start running into things like memory and storage restrictions a lot of the time, especially on the NES. I like to use that as an example because it's the most restrictive. The NES only has 2 kilobytes of onboard memory. It can be expanded through the cartridge up to 256 kilobytes. Storage space is also at a premium. So we use things like a technique called using meta tiles to sort of work around those restrictions. And what meta tiles are is a way that we can store an array of larger pieces of background. So instead of doing like individual 8x8 tiles, we can store like 16 by 16 or 32 by 32 predefined blocks in an array, and only load those into memory at a time. So it saves a lot on memory usage.
Awesome.
And so the next slide is just an example of a meta tile table. So these are all these individual 16 by 16 blocks that we'd be loading into memory instead of loading each individual piece of them. And a little Kanye West in the corner.
I did not realize that. Wow, that's pretty
great.
cool.
So another thing that we need to do to get around memory limitations is working with banks and bank swapping. So you can load a block of code or a block of graphical information into a bank and then load up pieces at a time instead of trying to load it all at once. And from there, you can sort of like swap and pick and choose what you're going to load into the game when you need it, as opposed to having to load like an entire page of information at one time.
So when you talk about those being on only specific mappers, can you walk us through what a mapper is? and why
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
important?
Yeah.
So that's a very much an NES kind of thing, is the mappers. Mappers talk about the certain type of board types that you're using. So when the NES first came out, they had the old black box titles like Donkey Kong and Excite Bike.
Gauntlet.
They were all very simple boards. They just had a program and a graphics chip on them. That's just about it. As the console moved along in its lifespan, though, you had games like Super Mario Bros. 3 that were much more graphically intense, had a lot more programming in them. So they had to create new board types that had new components on them to give them more memory, give them more space to load things. So that's what the mappers are, is the mappers are what type of board type you're using. So we tend to use NMMC3, which is one of the better mappers that existed. That's the same one Super Mario Bros. 3 uses.
Yeah.
So that we have a little bit more room as far as memory and storage is concerned.
Yeah. It's always fascinated me. It's basically like how much addressable ROM that the CPU can see.
Yeah.
And so it's added an extra chip to translate that.
Yeah. And so this just sort of demonstrates how we used banks graphically for our game Little Medusa. We work with 1K and 2K banks. We call them half banks and quarter banks to make it a little easier to talk about. Basically what that means is on the right side, you can see the sprites that are loaded up in RAM at once. We used half banks for that. So we can load in and out half of a page at a time to only load what we need when we need it. And then for the backgrounds, we could load in quarters at a time.
That's cool. I didn't realize that. Also, one follow-up question someone asked. You said GIMP, not Unity. You're not using Unity.
No, we're not using Unity for any of this stuff. We have a blog series on our website. So a lot of it's about Unity. A lot of it's about retro dev. So.
Yeah, well, the one thing I'll throw in about Unity is a lot of times we'll prototype in Unity.
Oh, absolutely,
Okay.
yeah.
Because one of the challenges of working under retro restrictions is that you're working in assembly and C, and that's not the most flexible languages to iterate on when you're talking about
Absolutely.
all the kind of challenges
Totally.
we're talking
Yeah.
about. So a lot of times we'll build a Unity project that has retro restrictions, and then we use that to do a lot of gameplay testing and mechanic testing.
Yeah, and do a lot of our iterative design stuff.
And then move that into the actual retro development.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
Unity is still a big part of our workflow,
Yeah, absolutely.
but it's not actually the thing that pops out our ROM.
Of course,
that
yeah,
we
yeah,
load.
yeah,
totally. You're basically saying, like, if you can get it right in Unity, you'll save a lot of cycles because the development is so much faster, and then you can, like, convert it to assembly.
Also, it's a little bit harder to do like iterative testing on a retro
That's what I'm
console.
saying.
So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's brutal.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
So what's cool is these are a lot of like very novel, modern techniques that you're applying to all of the technology that was available then. Have you seen any evidence of like kind of more obscure developers back at the time using some of these like patterns at all? Or were they all very new?
I think it was an evolution. So
Yeah.
as you see the consoles evolve, as you see like later stage NES games, you start to see a lot more modern sensibilities about them, like later like Jalico titles like Shadow of the Ninja and things
Yeah.
like that have a lot more modern sensibility to them. Or Vice Project Doom has like all kinds of modern stuff that didn't happen at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that also that console life cycle? You can kind of see the games that came out at launch and then the games that were the end of the console life, which is blasphemy for us to say. We're talking about retro development.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you can kind of see the spectrum of that evolution happening over the course of that history. So it's pretty cool stuff. But there's a mix of novel techniques and there's a mix of classic techniques that we're using.
Cool.
So this just goes over a little bit more about bank swapping. We can sort of use bank swapping to swap in and out individual character sprites. So like with enemies, if we want to have a large range of enemies in an NES game in a single level, we'll use bank swapping for that. So like once the one type of enemy's dead, we can load in another one real quick, and
That's
it'll
awesome.
seem like there's more loaded in than there really is.
Yeah. This is just so new to me.
Yeah,
I
man.
can't even tell you.
It's really
like,
amazing. I mean,
so cool.
They're just completely different considerations
Yep.
and
Yeah.
techniques.
Yeah, for sure. So if anyone's familiar with retro games, they'll be familiar with sort of like these larger background bosses in games.
Yes.
That was their way to get around having small sprite sizes, is they would render enemies in the backgrounds and then animate the backgrounds. That's tricky though, because you can only change 32 background tiles at once.
Wow.
That's as much as the PPU can process. So you have to use, even then, you have to use tricks to sort of like blend it together and make it look better.
I see. So just to give us an example, so this is a frog.
Yeah, this is a frog.
So like, how many tiles is this person? Or
I
this
don't
frog?
remember offhand,
But just
but
because
it's,
you say it's
yeah.
you can only swap around 32 at a time.
yeah, but we're
So
definitely
is that like
yeah.
Is
So
like,
we wanted to do more than 32 here, but we couldn't. So the next slide shows like a slowed down.
so you can like only move the mouth. Basically.
Yeah. So the way we did it, and this shows it a little bit better, is we swapped it out sort of pieces at a time. The bottom image of it shows it very slowly, so you can see it. And then if you play it fast enough, people won't really notice that.
I see.
So
Wait.
each frame is only moving 32 tiles at a time.
Yeah.
But since we break up which tiles we move when,
Yeah.
we can start to kind of cheat what those
But
limitations
that's why it
are.
doesn't look very fluid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially
Because
when
it
it's slowed
has-
down,
I
yeah.
see. Oh right, it is slowed down.
But the faster version, you can kind of cheat the eye a little bit, especially if you're doing this on CRTs also.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
CRTs are a lot friendlier to that retro experience.
Yeah, there's we call it sort of like pixel fuzz on an old CRT television, where the pixels sort of blend together with each other, and we can use that to our advantage.
I'm also just gonna pop your website. It's megacatstudios.com.
That's correct.
Okay, some people are asking. Okay, cool. Do these have a website? And then, okay. Yeah, let's keep going.
All right, yeah. So another trick that was really popular back in the day, and we like to use especially with cutscenes, is sprite layering. When I was talking about how you can only change palettes on backgrounds 16 pixel blocks at a time, what you can do is you can overlay sprites on top of that to cheat that. So I have an example from our game Little Medusa here, where you're talking. It's a boss talking to you, and we wanted her to have like sort of makeup on her face and different colored hair, and this water flowing down from her hands. So the first frame is just the background pieces of her. The second frame is just the sprite pieces of her, and then the third frame is it
Oh
all
my
compiled
God.
together.
It's like looking at Photoshop layers.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's essentially what we're doing, is we're using sprites to add a second layer that wasn't originally there.
Wow, that's really neat.
And so these are just questions that we ask ourselves commonly when we're designing retro games. We ask ourselves, what kind of experience do we want to offer? What hasn't been done on retro consoles? That ties back to the first one. What kind of games didn't we see back then?
That's what I was kind of curious, which is like you still have the same technology restrictions, but like what can you do today that was different?
Yeah,
because
so-
of like cultural.
Yeah, and I think a big part of it is just like sort of gameplay styles that didn't really exist back then is a good way to go about it. And so how do we combine those like ideas? Like we have achievements in our games for like we'll have like a
right.
battery backup save so we can have achievements in the games.
And that just wasn't
Cloud
really
saves.
a thing.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Can
Now-
you do like online multiplayer?
So I guess one thing along those
kinda
lines,
curious.
have you guys considered like providing an interface of some sort, so that like whether it's like a Wi-Fi chip or an Ethernet connection, so that you could actually have a retro game that pulls in or sends out game state?
We haven't really done anything like that. There's people who have done some early tests of things like that.
Yeah, there's some interesting hackers, modders doing stuff like that in the community.
Yeah, like there's a NES cartridge that can read
Yeah.
Twitter feeds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I know that earlier we heard from like Warp World and Crowd Control, and they have like some. I think it's there's a NES development cartridge that has a USB interface, and so you can actually have it plugged in via USB while it's in the NES.
Yeah, so like you're using like EverDrives and things like that.
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
doing really cool. So the crowd control guys, they're doing really cool stuff with like RAM sniffing and things like that. So they've done some pretty incredible work. I'd say in this world, in this universe, we might be on a different continent, but they're doing some cool stuff also.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah. I mean, there's
Definitely.
a lot of these titles. Like, I just always think about like what could be done if we could pull in some of that state to extensions, like to actually like power a visibility on Twitch, so that you have this
Totally.
concept
Yeah.
of this code that's running on a Nintendo, but is also communicating with like Twitch. It blows my
Yeah,
mind.
that kind of stuff really excites
Hey,
me.
if you want to help us do something like that, we would be down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We'd be
Yeah,
down.
for sure.
Yeah.
You gotta
I'm sure
talk
we'll be
to
talking
him.
more.
So we only have a few minutes, so let's see if we can get through. I don't know how many more slides you have.
Let's go ahead and jump more to the modern
Okay.
stuff.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna do this one real quick.
You have to nerd out. Go ahead.
I'll
Yeah,
ask
yeah.
less questions.
So this is just going over some of like the cool effects people used to make games look a little bit more exciting back then. So things like parallax scrolling or using scanline scrolling as well, like they did the title screen of Adventures of Bayou Billy, where you can do that neat wavy effect with it. Games like Swordmaster did a lot of neat things with parallax scrolling that are a combination of per scanline scrolling as well as using bank swapping animations to make those mountains in the background move.
This is getting very complicated.
Yeah, yeah. I don't have enough time to dig into it too much,
okay.
but
It's all right. It's
Yeah.
all right.
Okay. This is cool.
and we're going into manufacturing a
We'll
little
peek
bit.
at Let's back up really quick.
Manufacturing is very
Yeah, cool.
interesting.
So one of the cool things here that I want to emphasize as we run out of time. So you talk about modern sensibilities with retro games. So part of that's the game itself and the game design, mechanics we're using. But we also feel like the physical experience is also another thing that can be innovated on.
Yeah.
So that Logjammer's cartridge on the right is made out of actual wood. So that's a wooden
Yeah.
cartridge that you can plug in and
That's
play.
so cool.
The Fork Parker's Crunch Out, that was a collaboration with Devolver Digital for a Take This fundraiser. That's an actual LCD screen that lights up when you plug it into the Super Nintendo.
Sweet.
So there's we do like things with like acrylic, and we do some interesting printing and display stands. So there's some interesting things you do with the physical stuff itself.
Yeah, because we handle all the manufacturing ourselves, we get to do a lot of cool things they didn't get to do back in the
Totally.
day.
So it's the full experience, everything from opening the box
Yeah.
up to playing the game.
That's
You
great.
can innovate on.
And then I want to get into like some of the going from modern to retro to modern. This is just some examples of some games that we've done that with. Logjammers is one where we started off as an NES game. It's very much like a Windjammer style of game. And then from there, we made a modern upmake of it in Unity for PCs and consoles.
Awesome.
Coffee Crisis was our first big release. It started out as a Sega Genesis
Coffee
game.
Crisis. I like
Yeah,
that.
started out as a Sega Genesis game, and then we eventually remade it in Unity and added more cool modern things like Twitch integrations.
Oh my
and
gosh.
That's awesome.
all kinds of cool effects
Yeah.
to it.
Where can people download these games? Or
So
Or-
the retro games, you get them off our website.
Okay.
And then all the modern releases, Steam,
Steam? Okay.
Xbox
Switch,
One.
Xbox, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Cool.
you guys have like a storefront for physical
Yeah,
distribution.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
sweet.
Yeah,
That's
so
really cool.
we're here at TwitchCon showcasing Bite the Bullet. So modern PC release, but it also has a Sega Genesis prequel. So that's another thing we're thinking that is the next innovation of this retro development is